Next, I'd like to introduce Dave King. Dave King won the 2006 John Ware Writers Fund Rome Prize Fellowship for his best-selling debut novel, The Ha Ha, now in development as a film with Michael Shannon. His work has appeared in the Paris Review, The Village Voice, Fence, and the Italian literary journal Nuovi Argomenti, among other venues, and an essay, Once More to the Beach, is upcoming in conjunctions. A new novel is complete, a memoir, Bad Dog, is in the works, and a story, The Stamp Collector, will appear in the O. Henry Prize Stories 2018. Dave holds degrees from Cooper Union and Columbia University. Please welcome Dave King.
This won't take long. I'm at the end of my time here, and so I'm leaving on Wednesday, and I want to take a minute to thank Dana and Diego and Ilaria and Lucy and everyone else in the Civitella family for a really amazing and wonderful and deeply productive time. I could not have imagined how much work I would have done here. And if you have anything to do with this place, thank you so much. I also want to thank the other residents who are here who have just been splendid and wonderful and eye-opening. And really, I hope that some long friendships come out of this. And I'm particularly delighted to be reading with Dermot because I've spent the last week filling my diary with all the funny things he says, with his anecdotes and stuff. And I thought that was really a great reading, Dermot. Thank you so much. I'm going to read from this memoir I'm working on, Bad Dog, which is the story of a kind of reckless and disastrous year of my life when I was 18. The structure is very short chapters. And when I first started the book, I set up my computer so the borders were very wide because I wanted to look at it as a kind of ribbon passing very quickly. And I wanted the book to just move kind of rapidly with a lot of white space on the pages. It begins with 5 short pieces which introduce the themes of the book, which I guess are curiosity, desire, growing up, and the tension between belonging and isolation. And I'm going to read 2 of the 5 pieces that form a kind of bouquet as a prologue. How is it possible to tell this story without first spending 100 or so pages dissecting the era, that weird delta of time when a great stream of raised consciousness and, at least in my sector, progressive optimism coursed out of the 1960s and then abruptly spread thin? Was it actually like that? Like a river that lost force and grew diffuse? Was the optimism always a kind of mirage? Or was I too young to understand? Was whatever darkening I perceived in the world no more than the passage from childhood to beyond? I hit puberty in 1970, but by the time of my main story, it had been 7 years since the summer of love, and I was a young and clueless 18. In some later anecdotes, I'm much older. Politically, of course, the great awning cast over those days was Vietnam, the slow end of the war and the slide into Watergate, which, though historically separate dramas, seemed to coexist in the same roilingly emulsive cocktail like a lava lamp. By January 27, 1973, the day the Selective Service announced the end of the military draft, I'd carried a draft card in my wallet for more than a year. We were called from study hall into the cold of a New England night, several hundred chanting boys pounding the stone pathways of the prep school we attended, encountering girls spilling out of the girls' dormitories too, all of us aware that something large was afoot. In the chapel, the school's president said our futures had been returned to us. This, rather than the war's end, was the thrust of his talk. He spoke of the uncertainty that had been with us more than half our lives, and turning to the young men of the student body, said that shadow was now lifted. We no longer faced being called into war. We must all take a moment, he said, to seize back our lives, to mentally shake off the loom of conscription, and privately and personally resolve to rise to the opportunity. He reminded us of our school's ancient mission to provide faith-based education to poor boys and poor girls, cultivating a citizenry charged by scholarship and piety. Now, more than ever, he said, this was our sacred trust. At that, many of us turned to each other and said we wouldn't have gone to the war anyway. We were scrawny, long-haired boys in frayed bell-bottoms and thrift store overcoats, and we were cowardly and conformist in our skepticism of authority. So if our time came, we declared, we'd have fled to Canada or Sweden, or taken a meat cleaver to a baby toe, as someone's sister's ex-boyfriend was said to have done. Or bluffed our way out by pretending to be schizophrenic or paranoid. This strategy also was the subject of dorm rumors. The trick, evidently, was to acquire a psychiatrist's letter of diagnosis, as some guy who had graduated when we were sophomores had managed. A lefty doctor in Boston was said to dispense such letters as acts of resistance, so we heard. But guys without letters of mental defectiveness still had an out, so it was said. They could claim to be fags if they were willing to prove it, right there in the induction room with some stranger who apparently was on call for such purposes. The draft guys would watch to gauge the performance's veracity, so the rumor mill went. And you had to be really convincing. Otherwise, you might find yourself doing, all that and still wind up in the Mekong Delta. Sometimes in my little bed, I pictured this scenario in full evocative detail, wondering if the draft board guys wore uniforms or mere jackets and ties, and if the walk-in homo would be attractive or, diabolical army reasoning, old and stinky. Clearly, if I had to be drafted, this had potential as the one silver lining, as well as perhaps my only opportunity ever to have sex. Late one night in the spring of 1979, I lay in my New York apartment and resolved to become outgoing. It was perhaps 2 a.m, and I was still the person I'd been as a kid, alive to my friends, but in other cases blank and shy. And as I drifted off, I made a personal compact. Each day, I'd speak to one stranger and build on that. The project took years, but it actually worked. I got up the next morning to walk the girl, the white knee-high mongrel who described my sphere of influence. And at 7th and A, I looked hard at the pork pie-hatted guy who owned Ray's candy store and said, "Hi." For years, Ray had seen me drop a quarter in his palm and silently shiver at times from the stack. But now he looked up in astonishment. "Well, how are you?" he said. Then he gave the girl a biscuit. What had happened? The night before, I'd gone to a college party in a tenement on 2nd Avenue. Beer and music and open windows and smoke, the space a great bladder of dimness bustling with art students. I was an art student too by then, and though I was not great at parties, at some point I decided, as a kind of thought experiment, to reflexively answer yes to every offer and invitation. So there I was, leaning against a wall like some cartoon of a male, waiting for disinhibition to kick in. Across the room, a sweet guy named Art put up a hand and began moving through the crowd. And when he reached me, I knew I'd lean in and growl, "As far as I'm concerned, Art is just a guy's name." And Art would chuckle and say he'd always been Artie. This was our standard exchange. But before that could happen, a song came on the stereo, and someone hollered to turn it up. Kool and the Gang, if memory serves. A lone fluorescent ring lit the alcove where the record player had been set up in the kitchen, and from where I stood, that small strip of illumined kitchen was like a stage, and we in the darker area were like an audience. A cigarette flared, a trio of heads shifted, and suddenly I had a view of that stage, where one person danced delightedly, all by herself. Baby, my dearest friend, in black pants and dark t-shirt, energetically swiveling her hips, shaking her shoulders, pointing her elbows, parting the air with her chin, her knees, her hair and flesh. No one seemed to be watching, and I might not have noticed either, but for the wedge where the crowd allowed a view. Now, propped on my wall, I sipped my beer from its bottle and saw how thoroughly a person could dance for herself. How just tossing her hair made her joyful, lips red, smile wide. How she used every part of her, limbs, sinews, muscles, bones, as Kool Bell declared that it was all about the funk, y'all. A couple times in my life I've made the mold from one type of person into someone quite different, but only then did I do it with such intent. Standing upright in my wallflower bed, I watched baby seize whatever good the night offered, and even before art reached me, felt something of a coup de foudre. A bubbling wish to be that self, that fully expressive person, the one who was over there, dancing with such entireness, such abandon, such fuck all, instead of the self who was here. The next morning, for the first time, I said hi to Ray, the news dealer. When I was in high school, I expected to go to Yale University, and when I received my letter of rejection, I hitchhiked 112 miles to New Haven and went to the admissions office and demanded an explanation. There was a nice young guy there in the admissions office. He had given me my interview, and he asked for my file and read through it, kind of scratching his head and trying to figure out what had happened. And then he went, and he held up a piece of, he held it up like this, as though it was like a medical specimen, and, maybe a little dirty. And he passed it to me, and it was a letter from my guidance counselor saying that of all the students who had ever passed through the school, I was the most disruptive and the biggest disciplinary headache, and that she could not, in good conscience, recommend me as a member of the Yale community. So it was clear even then that if I had been a macho kid, and if my rebellion had taken the form of, playing lacrosse in the hallways and, shouting and beating my chest, or if it had even been political, if I'd been an activist, a kind of Abby Hoffman-Monkey, I would have ruffled fewer feathers. So this is a short piece about what was actually going on for us. The political was cultural. The tide of it touched everyone across our school and beyond, whereas what our little gang felt seemed decidedly personal. To varying degrees, we were all emasculate boys, speaking camp to power in loud, if intuitive ways. This, not politics or resistance or anything grassroots, was what made us stand out. Simultaneous with Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, there had arisen in American culture an inexplicable nostalgia boom. No Nanette and the Boyfriend, and Bette Midler touring with a show like something from the Orpheum Circuit. I bought the cast album of No Nanette and spontaneously performed its big number, I Want to Be Happy, on the dorm staircase during study hall, backed by other lithe boys pretending to tap dance. Another night I belted out Mama Cass's Dream a Little Dream with my friend David banging away at the piano, delighting in the house mother's cries to keep it down. Out in the world, Bowie was appearing in makeup. Mick Jagger pranced and preened across a stage, and at our age, it was anyone's guess whether this was theater or profoundly real. Sometimes David painted his nails. Sometimes I wore girls' shirts. Our friend Dobbs, who would work as a costume designer in Paris and be dead 16 years later, bought a series of a series of platform shoes and slowly grew swishier, more so even than he was in fluffy slippers. Another friend made a wonderful, extravagantly tall Diana Ross. We'd interrupt school dances so this guy could lip-sync "You Keep Me Hanging On" with 6 or 7 jubilant Supremes behind him. Boys, girls, splayed hands working in unison. And there ain't nothing I can do about it. Gathering in the back at chapel, we laughed archly at our own jokes. We discovered Noel Coward and affected his cultured voice. The strutting gait came from who knew where. We erupted in hallways and at dinner, mocking jock culture, study nerds, dowdy teachers and with-it teachers, ass-kissers, people in power, guys who played air guitar, fans of the Who. We communicated in Abendglabisch, a ridiculous language a bit like Pig Latin, and sought any chance to insert our small nonconformity, not comprehending that who we were just beginning to suspect we might be, was more of a sting than any sting we could imagine. We were unruly. We were often annoying, but we sang in the choir and performed in school plays, read a lot, and kept our grades mostly up. As a group, as individuals, we were not dark, angry, or threatening, and we weren't really slackers. Included in our gang were rebel girls and even girlfriends, cheerful, brainy spirits who were tribe members first and secondly part of a couple. In the 3 years I was at that school, some of us quit eating meat, some embraced crafts or baking or tarot. Almost everyone but me learned TM, and in our junior year, one person found Jesus. I did too briefly until I realized the prayer meetings cut into my free time. Some of my friends had weekend drug regimens, but there I was a lightweight, always fearful I might kiss the wrong lips. We were immature, we were giddy and self-absorbed, and we threw things, shoes, wads of paper, once, inspiredly, a pitchfork, out our windows at people we considered mundane, but a case could be made for our having school spirit. We were not openly queer. I had beat off once with my friend Fred, but resolved never to examine it, and I doubt anyone seriously weighed coming out. Our school's first gay dance was organized by a heterosexual classmate who wanted to tweak bourgeois boundaries, and whose other great brainstorm was a Dadaist Grateful Dead fan club, essentially meetings at which we bowed down to San Francisco. It's easy, again in hindsight, to distinguish fruity revelry from more staid, sweaty mischief. But that at the time, from the inside, it all was a seamless whirl. And without belaboring the point, it was no doubt because we weren't lacrossing up the hallways that our growing pains went into so-called outrageousness. Divine decadence, power to the people. Who could place such ideas in a fraction? All sorts of baggy stuff passed through my consciousness, dissociated, undigested, and got expressed, though usually indirectly, for ours was an ecosystem in which candor had no outlet. We had just one escape hatch, resistance to authority. Under that rubric fell the inchoate desire, the inchoate campy desire to flaunt the mainstream. Not that the mainstream viewed us as freedom fighters. And the last section I'm going to read just describes the trip back from New Haven after seeing this ghastly letter from my guidance counselor. The journey from school to New Haven had been unmemorable. One moment I was amid dozens of boys tearing into the white envelopes I hadn't realized would come so soon. The next, a green chair in the admissions office. But the next morning, my host dropped me at the entrance ramp to northbound I-91, and around Hartford, I got a lift in a white van filled with record albums and French horns. The driver introduced himself as David Amram, possibly expecting me to know who he was. And though at that point I'd have been hard pressed to identify almost anyone, the broader package, the van filled with horns, the relaxed mass of brown curls, the big clunky thing of beads over a coarse open-necked shirt, even the destination, a Vermont farm I took for a commune, all seemed very real. Also the way he spoke to me. He didn't mention Allen Ginsberg or Greenwich Village at first. He didn't say beat or bebop or even bohemian, and only later did I realize he came from that scene. But he said he was looking forward to jamming and hanging out. Then he spoke of improvisation and said chance was a creative strategy. Where he was headed, he said, everyone sang or played an instrument. Then he talked about play and experimentation. That was his way of speaking, a transitionless toggle between concrete subjects like what he'd find in Vermont and more challenging, abstract pronouncements about art. The most interesting stuff being done in all fields, he declared, resulted from being alive to the moment. I tried to look like I got it. I was accustomed, of course, to intelligent speech, but the thinking I'd learned in school was critical and analytical. In class, we were taught to be culture consumers, not culture makers. But David proposed notions I wouldn't articulate until years later, that the thought process of the artist is different from the response of the aficionado. That to think about an artist's methods is to contemplate a living journey, separate from assessing a work's final destination. It's possible he knew this was over my head, or maybe not. I'm not sure he gave much thought to how young I was, how sophisticated or silly or hip. In those days, I breathed with my mouth open, according to my friends, and had a habit of staring. Because I was reluctant to stare at his handsome face, I looked at his hands, which were meaty on the steering wheel, with big knuckles and square, glittering wrists. After a while, he named some people he'd worked with. One, Gregory Corso, I'd even heard of. I felt comfortable enough by then to choose a name, Peter Orlovsky, and admit I didn't know who it was. And David said he was a poet. I might like the work. Look him up, he said. Around Springfield, we began to see patches of dirty snow along the highway, and I dreaded going back to school. I wished I could tag along to whatever waited at that Vermont commune, for by then I'd formed an opinion of David's life as alternative to the path where I'd crashed and burned. In his world, so I imagined, all you needed were will and ingenuity. Then you skipped college entirely and let randomness occur. You aimed your energy at the present. That was a process I thought I could master. You waited. I was waiting for some glory to arise. Of course, I was wrong, at least about David Amram. He was conservatory trained. Bernstein had appointed him guest conductor of the New York Phil. But I knew nothing of that. Stealing a glance at the spot where his adult neck rose from the rough-woven shirt, I wished he'd decide to let chance be a strategy, invite me to stay all the way to Vermont, pass me off as his kid brother, teach me an instrument, show me how to be alive in the moment. With luck, I wouldn't come back. But I told him my exit number, and when we got there, he pulled over and amiably shook my hand. As I climbed out, he reached behind the seat and gave me the soundtrack of Pull My Daisy, the Robert Frank Alfred Leslie film for which he'd written the music. I took my album back to campus and stormed into the guidance counselor's office, yelling that she'd ruined my life. And after 2 or 3 minutes, a campus officer showed up and escorted me from the building. I never spoke to the woman again, though I spotted her occasionally, most weirdly years later at my grandmother's wake. They were acquainted through an old friend of Grandma's with whom the counselor maintained a Boston marriage for decades. Nor were there consequences to my siege on her office. The school let the incident drop, presumably in the hope that I'd do the same. My parents paid tuition, after all, assuming the institution would aid, not thwart, my college plans, and they'd have certainly caused a ruckus if they'd known of the letter. But the letter embarrassed me, so I never told them about it. Thank you very much. Oh, weren't they great? Yeah. Well, you know, they're Jack Purcell's. They're the coolest sneakers in America.